Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 1 of my Final Fantasy retrospective. This is, I think, the second series retrospective I'm doing, following the Shin Megami Tensei retrospective. Final Fantasy is probably my favorite RPG series. I love it, even with all its ups and downs, so I really want to go through and show off my Final Fantasy collection and let you know about a whole bunch of the stuff that came out over here. While Japan had just a ton of merchandise for Final Fantasy, we didn't get that much over here, but what we did get is pretty interesting. And for this part, I'm going to go through the first 3 games in the series. So everything that came out for Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3. In recent years, we've had a ton of extra stuff for every game, like plushies and art and figures, but I'm just going to go through the main stuff that came out, because, that stuff gets really hard to track. So let's kick it off with the first game in the series, Final Fantasy 1. So let's start off with the first game in the series, Final Fantasy 1, which was originally released for the Famicom in Japan on December 18th of 1987. After the NES version was out in Japan, the MSX got a version. Because that system never came out over here, of course we didn't get that. This version was basically the same as the Famicom, but it features some graphical updates. So the NES version that we got out over here was Final Fantasy, which came out about 2.5 years after the original Japanese release. This is basically the NES long box, which has the original, what's in here? The huge book, because they figured people wouldn't understand how to play RPGs at the time, and maybe they were right since it was an early one. It's got a map. Mine is a bit torn, but finding this old stuff in its pristine condition is nearly impossible. So yeah, here is a map that covers many of the dungeons and shows a bunch of enemies on the back. Oh, this is in terrible condition. I need to tape this up, or I don't know. It also features all these extra pages, which are different maps and information on enemies, and of course, the cartridge itself. Final Fantasy 1 was updated and released for the WonderSwan in Japan as well. That's a decent addition that was used as the base for a lot of the additions that came later, mostly because it updated the graphics to 16-bit style sprites. And the last solo release of the game is the 20th anniversary edition that came out on the PSP. This version featured FMVs, which are featured in the PlayStation game we'll talk about soon, the new dungeon from the GBA version we'll talk about soon, and an even harder new dungeon called the Labyrinth of Time. The 3DS also had a version of the game that was released only in Japan that was basically just a port of this game with 3D. And that brings us to some of the compilations that came out later. I guess because they thought 1 and 2 were harder to sell on their own, they combined the two into a couple different releases, starting with, in Japan only, the Famicom release of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. Now this features slightly updated graphics over the original, but not so much. Following that, we have Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls for the GBA. This version featured a ton of changes. It used graphics that were similar to the WonderSwan color version. The game was also a lot easier than the previous ports. There were 4 new Soul of Chaos Challenge dungeons, which feature new items and monsters, including bosses from later Final Fantasy games. And finally, for PS1, we got Final Fantasy Origins, which is a release of the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 premium package that came out in Japan. This game features the WonderSwan graphics, but up to higher resolutions. It also introduced a new remix soundtrack and a CG intro movie. It also has an optional easy mode, and the script was completely rewritten. The game is a turn-based RPG created by Hironobu Sakaguchi, with concept art by Yoshikata Amano and music composed by Nobu Uematsu. These 3 heavy hitters on the series continue working on Final Fantasy up through Final Fantasy X. Sakaguchi wanted to create an RPG for years, but Square execs thought it wouldn't sell well. He only got the chance once Enix's Dragon Quest series sold like crazy in Japan. It's also really important to note that while Final Fantasy 1 is often compared to Dragon Warrior 1 because of the release dates over here, the game actually came out in Japan almost a year after Dragon Quest 3, so looking at those two are probably a better comparison of quality at the time. The game design was based on Dungeons & Dragons: The Tabletop Rule Set and the Wizardry Dungeon Crawler. Originally it was going to be called Fighting Fantasy, but they were forced to change the name because of a trademark. Old rumors were that the game was named Final Fantasy because it was Squaresoft's last chance to make a successful game, or because it was the last game Sakaguchi was going to make before leaving Square. While there's some truth to both of those things, the reason for the name is still often debated. The story involves a world that's been in decline since the four elements, wind, fire, earth, and water, have gone out of control, and the four orbs which reflected those elements went dark. A prophecy tells of four warriors of light who will appear in the world in order to restore the orbs and bring balance back to the land. The game starts with the warriors saving a princess from the evil Garland, and then defeating the elemental fiends in order to restore the orbs. Despite a plot that may sound fairly generic now, the game featured some very unique settings, including a space station and a time travel element to the plot. The game allowed the player to choose the classes for their four warriors, making some customization to the party. The classes would also eventually be promoted to different but similar classes over the course of the game. So to get into some of the extra stuff that was released over here for Final Fantasy, we have the Final Fantasy 1 and 2 original soundtrack. Now this 2-disc soundtrack wasn't really released over here, but you can get it as part of the touring Distant Worlds concert. That's where I picked this one up pretty recently, so still pretty easy to get a hold of if you go to those concerts. Also, getting into some of the books, the first and most notable one is the Final Fantasy Strategy Guide, which is actually issue 17 of Nintendo Power. So every once in a while, I think there was only 2 or 3 of these, but Nintendo Power would put out a book that was a complete walkthrough for a game, notably Super Mario Bros. 3. But yeah, Final Fantasy came out as one of those, and this is just a cool thing that they put out back then. Following up on that, we got the guidebook from Brady Games for the PSP 20th anniversary game, as well as the Dawn of Souls book, so the guide that covers both Final Fantasy 1 and 2 GBA game, and the same thing for Origins, so basically walkthroughs for Final Fantasy 1 and 2, the Origins version. And that's it for Final Fantasy 1, so let's move right into Final Fantasy 2, which may not be the Final Fantasy 2 you know, depending on how well you know this series. Final Fantasy 2 was released for the Famicom just a year after the first game. So, other than the original Famicom release, we got a WonderSwan release, just like the first game. Basically the same thing with a couple upgraded graphics. We got the 20th anniversary edition for PSP, so same as the first game, just updated graphics, sound, all that stuff. And finally, one thing I have that's not really part of a collection, but still cool to have, is the Final Fantasy II repro cart that's based on the original prototype, but a little more polished and finished up. This version is from Time Walk Games, which itself is pretty interesting, but you can look them up separately. But yeah, I mean, these games have been fans translated, so even though we couldn't get them here at the time, there's still a way to experience the game as it was originally designed. This game was planned to come out for the NES, and a translated prototype was completed, but it wasn't quite complete, and based on how late it would have launched into the NES's lifespan, they just dropped it altogether. The original idea behind this sequel was to do everything in a completely different direction. They introduced a new world and story, and created a battle system that was completely different from the original game. Many team members from the original Final Fantasy team returned to work on this game, including the battle designer Akitoshi Kawazu, who went on to create the Saga series, which definitely sees its roots in this game. Final Fantasy II had a huge focus on story, in which the player is given control of 4 kids whose parents are killed when the Empire invades their hometown. They're nearly killed themselves when they try to escape, but manage to rise up and fight back against the Emperor. The game's battle system features major changes, the biggest one being the way you level up. Instead of traditional experience, characters' individual skills are raised based on usage or need. When using a skill or attack, or when taking damage, there's a chance that skill will increase. But because of the random nature of the system, the game is considered difficult and many players resort to cheating the system to build stats in a way that takes grinding to a whole new level. One other interesting feature of the game is the ability to learn keywords that you can use to ask different town people about different conversation topics. This adds some more depth to the NPC conversations in the game. For kind of extra Final Fantasy II stuff, the only thing I have worth mentioning is the 20th Anniversary Strategy Guide for PSP. Which brings us to the next game, which was never released over here, but was big in Japan. Final Fantasy III for the Famicom, released about a year and a half after Final Fantasy II. Similar to Final Fantasy II, I have a repro card, although I didn't get the nice Time Walk one with all the box and maps and stuff. But yeah, still a cool way to check this game out, because there is really no way to play the original kind of 2D version of the game in English. Eventually this game did come out in English, but as a complete 3D remake for the DS. This 3D remake was used as the basis for a lot of other versions, including a Japanese-only PSP physical release, which did come out over here digitally, and iOS and Android versions you can check out. Notably, it was a launch title, I believe, for the Ouya, so really that was the only reason I originally backed that thing. But eventually, when you could just download this version in English on the PS Vita TV, that's the way I like to play it now. A version was in development for the WonderSwan like the first two games, but the dev team found it too difficult to fit everything on a cart with a size limitation, so they abandoned that release. Final Fantasy III steps back a lot of the changes we saw in the previous game, but it also introduces the job system, which has been featured in several Final Fantasy games since. The story takes place in a world where an advanced civilization on a floating continent abused the power of the 4 light crystals, wrecking the balance between the light and dark. 4 warriors saved the world, but doomed the floating continent. A millennia later, 4 orphans get the power of the light crystals and have to stop history from repeating by bringing balance to the light and dark again. So even in terms of story and theme, very similar to the first game. The big change to the game, of course, is the job system, which allows the player to unlock and switch between 22 jobs for their characters. This introduces a bunch of new battle commands into the game as well. The game is the first to show damage above the enemy instead of as text below, and auto-target new enemies when the first one dies for physical attacks. It also is the first to feature summons, and I believe it's the first to feature chocobos and mogs, or at least one of those two. Again, from Distant Worlds, I picked up the soundtrack. This is specifically a soundtrack of the DS game, so I'd probably have to find an older release to get the original soundtrack from the Famicom, but you know, this is alright for that. I have the strategy guide from Brady Books for, again, the DS remake. And then the last two things on this table are just some compilation art books. So the first one that came out quite a bit before we started getting a ton of Final Fantasy art books is Dawn, the Worlds of Final Fantasy, which includes a lot of Amano's art for the first 4 Final Fantasy games. Just a really cool book at the time. We didn't have anything else like this, but that was quickly overshadowed by the first of 3 The Sky, the Art of Final Fantasy art books put out by Dark Horse. Now, this is actually part of a big box set of books, but I'm only pulled this one out today because it covers the first 3 games specifically. So this is a great art book. The box was really expensive on release, but I think it's dropped down to an affordable price recently. So if you can still get it, I highly recommend it for Final Fantasy fans. And that's it for part 1 of my Final Fantasy retrospective. I'm not sure when I'll get to part 2, but obviously I'm going to try and get through 4, 5, and 6 there, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you want more retrospectives. As always, I'm doing my full console retrospectives, and we're doing a bunch of quick looks at games that never came out over here, so stay tuned for that stuff too if you're interested. See you guys next time. Bye.